Hello, everybody.
Hi. We're continuing in Ray Franz's book on the chapter Blood and Life, Law and Love. Last time we were speaking about the forbidden components of blood for Jehovah's Witnesses, and now we're going to talk about what is permissible, at least 30 years ago when he wrote this book. So the first point here. A major factor to keep in mind is that the Watchtower organization's argumentation seeks much of its support in provisions of the Mosaic Law, commanding that the blood of slaughtered animals be poured out, this being cited as though justifying the organization's objection to any storing of human blood. Remember also that it presents the blood components it allows as constituting only a negligible amount of blood. Then consider these facts with regard to the components the organization classes as permissible.
One of these is albumin. Albumins are primarily used in connection with burns and severe bleeding. A person with third-degree burns, over 30 to 50% of his body, would need about 600 grams of albumin. Watchtower policy would allow this. How much blood would be needed, though, to extract this quantity? It would take from 10 to 15 liters from, that is 10.6 to 15.9 quarts of blood to produce that quantity of albumin. This is hardly a small amount. It is also obvious that the liters of blood from which it is derived were stored, not poured out. Similarly with immunoglobulins, gamma globulins, to produce sufficient gamma globulin for one injection by syringe, a vaccination persons, including Jehovah's Witnesses, traveling to certain southern countries may take as protection against cholera. Close to 3 liters of blood are needed as the source of supply. This is still more blood than is generally employed for a common blood transfusion. And again, the gamma globulin is drawn from blood that is stored, not poured out.
Hemophiliac preparations, factors 8 and 9, remain. Before these preparations came to use, the average lifespan of a hemophiliac in the 1940s was 16.5 years. Today, due to these blood-derived preparations, a hemophiliac may reach a normal lifespan. To produce preparations that could keep a hemophiliac alive over that period of time would require extractions from an estimated 100,000 liters of blood. Even though the hemophiliac preparations themselves represent only a fraction of that total, when we consider their source, we must ask how this could possibly be viewed as involving a small amount of blood.
The use of any of these blood components obviously implies storage of large, even massive amounts of blood. On the one hand, the Watchtower organization decrees as allowable the use of these blood components, and thereby the storage involved in their extraction and production, while, on the other, they state that they are opposed to all storage of blood, as biblically condemned. This is the sole basis they give for prohibiting the use of autologous word I'm not familiar with, autologous blood by a witness, that is, the person's having some of his own blood stored and then returned to his bloodstream during or following surgery. Clearly, the positions taken are arbitrary, inconsistent, and contradictory. It is difficult to believe that the formulators, and also the writers of explanations and defenses, of such policy are so ignorant of the facts as to fail to see the inconsistency and arbitrariness involved. Yet that alone could save the position from also being termed dishonest.
To rule in matters of health and medical treatment, prohibiting this and allowing that, is to tread on dangerous ground. In the one case, we may I'm sorry, my site's going funny here. Okay, in the one case, we may prove guilty of creating an irrational fear, and in the other, we may create a false sense of security. The course of wisdom and humility is to leave the responsibility to decide on such distinctions, where it belongs in the first place, with the conscience of the individual. Watchtower articles on the subject of blood stress the uncompromising position taken on blood by the organization, frequently praising its own policies as safeguarding the health and life of its members. Rarely, if ever, does one read any data or experiences unfavorable to those policies.
Recent articles claim that the organizational policies have protected members from contracting AIDS. An Awake article in the October 8, 1988 edition makes this claim. The same article points out on page 11 that, quote, by early 1985, most of the 10,000 Americans with severe hemophilia had been infected with the AIDS virus, unquote. The October 22, 1990 issue of Awake, page 8, updates this, saying, quote, hemophiliacs, most of whom use a plasma-based clotting agent to treat their illness, were decimated. In the United States, between 60 and 90% of them got AIDS before a procedure was set up to heat treat the medicine in order to rid it of HIV. End of quote. Similarly, the June 15, 1985 Watchtower, in an article titled Britain, Blood and AIDS, states on page 30 that, quote, some 70 million units of concentrated factor VIII, unquote, were imported from the United States to treat British hemophiliacs, and goes on to say, quote, it seems that by importing this blood product, the AIDS virus was transferred to the British supply, end of quote.
While containing much praise of the practices, the protective power of the organization's policies on blood, there is one thing that all these articles fail to point out to their readers. It is that those hemophiliacs, thus infected, got their infection primarily from a blood source that the Watchtower Society had officially declared as permissible. Factor VIII hemophiliac preparations extracted from plasma. As the October 22, 1990 Awake, pages 7 and 8 shows, some incidents of AIDS infection had also come through tissue transplants, which are similarly pronounced allowable by the organization.
All of this illustrates both how foolish and how utterly wrong it is for an organization to assume to have the wisdom and the divine authority to embark on the development of a complicated set of standards and of technical distinctions, and then impose this as an obligatory moral rule, deciding for others in what case and in what circumstances a matter can be counted as either outside or within the realm of personal conscience. So the article goes on with more about the risks for both taking and refusing blood.
But it is very arbitrary and inconsistent, because what you're telling Jehovah's Witnesses is that they can do this and they can't do that. The stuff that they're allowed to take means somebody else is disobeying God's law, according to you.
Yeah.
And you can reap benefits from their doing something that God would be disapproving. What sense does that make? If everyone was a Jehovah's Witness, we wouldn't be able to use anything according to the way they have designated what's proper and not proper.
And it is true, and I think I took some consolation in this back in the day, that you were protected from a lot of things by the prohibition upon blood.
Yeah.
But we, of course, didn't look at the evidence that people were losing their lives. That never made that never made the headlines in the Watchtower's own publications unless it involved some violation by some doctor or official, legal official, violating the conscience of a Jehovah's Witness or their family. That did make the headlines, but the miseries that the policy caused for, and the deaths.
And I think his point is that you're not really making a personal conscience decision. You know, whereas other people who are in an accident, they're talking to the doctors and they're given all the pros and cons when they're talking to them, and then they can decide. You're not given that opportunity, and my goodness, it must be a nightmare for the poor doctors. Because not only if you're in a tragic situation like that where you have to act fast a lot of the time, you can't, I mean, you're not going to know all this. I wouldn't have memorized all this information. You're not going to be able to make a decision based on what you're told from the medical field. You'll have to go away and, you know, find the elders or something to figure out what's allowable and what isn't.
I do remember when we took the new publication that was published, was it in the 70s, when we published this gigantic manual of alternatives to blood transfusions, and elders were assigned in local congregations to take this
to the medical
to the hospitals, as far as I recall.
Yeah.
It seemed like such a noble task that we were being asked to perform. But at least we felt we were informing the medical profession of what options were available, and therefore being loving towards them. Like you said, though, what a nightmare for a doctor who has to make this kind of choice.
Yeah, and for the persons faced with this.
Of course, for the witnesses
situation,
too.
it must be an awful time.
And one is reminded of that text again, where Christ said, "You load heavy loads on the shoulders of men, but you yourselves are not willing to budge them with your little finger." Next time, more about the risks involved, both from the standpoint of risk taking, if you take blood, and risk from refusing.